come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus, they noticed that some of his disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands, thus observing the tradition of the elders. And they do not eat anything from the market unless they wash it. And there are also many other traditions that they observe, the washing of cups, pots, and bronze kettles. So the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?" And he said to them, "Isaiah prophesies rightly about you hypocrites, as it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You abandon the commandment of God and hold to human tradition.'" And then he called the crowd again and he said to them, "Listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that is going in that can defile, but the things that come out are what defile. For it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come: fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, folly. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
My father was born in 1916 in the town of East Longmeadow, Massachusetts. It's a town that borders right along the edge of Massachusetts and Connecticut. And he said that on various times throughout his youth, his father would pile the family in their car, a brand name called Moon. Ever heard of the Moon Auto Company? You never will, probably. And they would go down to Summers and out on the outskirts of a Shaker farm. And they would go down on a Sunday evening and you could hear the singing of the Shakers, a religious group that was very interesting insofar as they all were taken on celibacy, so men and women didn't get married. They lived in separate dormitories, and it was a most interesting experiment, and part of that experiment was they looked upon Jesus, and in the Gospels it was clear that Jesus wasn't married, and so they thought, aha, this is a most excellent way of following the example of Jesus. Now, that sounds all very good, but when you have a group of people who are all celebrant, what happens after a few years? Well, this is what happens. Many years later, Leslie and I are on vacation in New Hampshire, and there's a Shaker farm. Anybody been to New Hampshire Shaker farm? Wonderful. You can go and see exactly how these people lived. And there were two elderly ladies, kind of the last two Shakers left, as you can imagine. Lovely, lovely women, and someone else took us on a tour. And if you are familiar, for example, with Shaker carpentry, furniture they make, beautiful simplicity, and major furniture makers today are making a mint off of that design. And so it occurred to me that, well, this was an idea of taking something that probably didn't make much sense. And I asked myself, didn't it ever occur to you that after a while there's not going to be anyone left? But in their minds, it was the perfect following of Jesus. Now, in the Gospel this morning, look very carefully at what's going on. Now, look here where it says, I have to find it for you, okay? Very important. Okay, they're all doing these things because of the elders of the past. Now, the elders of the past primarily were talking about the priests who attended to the temple, to the sacrifices. And for they and they alone, it was prescribed a tradition that you wash your hands before you go into the temple and before you make a sacrifice, you do this. Now, in that observation, as time goes on, people say, well, if the priests are doing it, then maybe we ought to too. And so the eating with defiled hands becomes critically important. It's a rite. It's almost like a little cult that you follow, because in so doing, you are somehow pleasing to God in that particular action. That the action in itself proves yourself worthy to be standing in front of God. But in this case, when they come and they accuse Jesus' disciples of eating with undefiled hands, he's ready and willing right to hit them where it doesn't belong, okay? So he says, now Isaiah prophesies rightly about you hypocrites, tough language. This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are from me. And in vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. He's reminding these Pharisees of what they should know from the background of the prophets. And all of the prophets are filled with this type of speaking, aren't they? You know, Amos. Is it Amos? I got to stop and think now. My biblical knowledge is escaping me. Amos, I think it was Amos, who said, your celebrations, your festivals, your new moons, your Sabbaths. And he says, I hate them. I hate them. Let justice flow like streams, like rivers coming down, flooding the earth with compassion. And when that essence of what God calls us to do is forgotten, and we push those into traditions that we think are substitutes, then we're got in big problems, very big problems. So there is the whole schema of what we do and how we say it. And we have traditions in our own liturgy, how we do things. There is a proper way that we do things. And every once in a while, if you really want to shake somebody up, just remove one of those. And I will guarantee someone will come out there, shake my hand and say, what are you doing? We didn't do such and such. Okay. Now, Luther had an answer for that. And he called this adiaphora. It's of secondary importance. And he will always say what is most important is that the gospel be preached and the sacraments be done. If you can do those two things, you can surround all of that with a whole variety of things, a variety of music, a variety of prayers, a variety of devotions, and so on, but get down to the essence of why we gather together. Now, I said in the beginning that Marty would have ruined the second half of my sermon. But it is in collusion with something else that happened this week, because I received an email of an inquiry into our church. And it was from a man who is a member of another Lutheran church. And in it he says, I guess to me as the pastor, I am upset about what is happening in my church. And he said, I want to know if what I heard is true, that you don't display the American flag in your sanctuary. Now, I know where he's coming from because I've gone through this before in my previous church. Now, in the early Lutheranism, very often, you didn't necessarily have flags. As a matter of fact, when the first Lutherans came over, there weren't many flags to go around at that point. But most certainly, at the beginning of the First World War, native Germans who came over here and became citizens of the United States were very fearful that they would be seen as sympathetic to what Germany was doing. And so, to show their patriotism, the American flag would come in and would simply say, this is not who we are. We are Americans. And when the attack was done on the buildings in New York, the World Trade Center, in the town where I lived, there was a gas station, and it was run by people who had escaped Iran. And everybody knew that they came from Iran, and the day following the destruction of that center, they put several American flags in front of their gas station. And what they were saying to their customers is, don't think that we are one of them. And so patriotism comes very close and within our own beings and how we live and how we move, our democracy, our republic, and so on. You can't possibly separate those things. And I know what this man is going to say. And I'm debating whether I want to reply to his email. I might. And I might simply say to him, but we do have a flag, and it is in our fellowship hall. And he will say, no, it deserves to be in the sanctuary. And I'll say, no. Because from time immemorial, the sanctuary of any Christian church is called a sanctuary because people can find sanctuary there. And in the European custom, if the government was after you, you would run to the church and stay there, and you would find sanctuary because that plot, that land, that building was apart from the government. And as a result, this is where you could find safety in some form over and against a government that may be trying to suppress you or in any way trying to arrest you. So there's the problem. Now, Marty. This is a letter that was received here in the church from the Faith and Freedom Coalition. Are you familiar? Well, they're letting me know as a pastor what I can do, and it's called Knowing the Legal Rules for Churches and Politics. Thank you so much. And it says what I may not do. Now, these are the things that I'm not supposed to do. I cannot endorse candidates on behalf of this church and should never do so from the pulpit or any other church meeting, either directly or indirectly. I can live with that. I've lived with that since I was ordained. I was told I was. Thanks for letting me know what I already know. I may not contribute funds or services directly to candidates or political committees. I can't distribute material that clearly favors one candidate or political party. You will not see me standing at the end of it and slipping you a pamphlet. I won't do that. I cannot pay fees for political events or from church funds. Set up a political committee that contributes funds to any candidate. And no campaign or political committee should allow a campaign or political committee to solicit such funds while speaking at a church. Now, in order to make me feel good, on the other side is what a church may do. We can do voter registration that does not endorse a political candidate or party. Now, we've done that, haven't we? We have become a voting site. And that, of course, is very neutral. We don't ask anybody, hey, who are you going to vote for? Really? Come over here, let me talk to you. No, we can't do that. Distribute material that is educational but does not endorse a particular candidate. We can do that. But I have the feeling that it's hard to find educational material that doesn't slant one way or another, because it's just the way we're built. I may, conduct candidate issue forums where all candidates are given equal opportunity. The same applies to elected officials or candidates invited to address a church service. We can do that. We can bring two people up here and let them shoot each other right in front of us. Right in front of us in a church that has a sanctuary that was built for something else. Now, I can lobby on potential legislation as long as the amount budgeted is not a substantial amount of its annual budget, 5% or less. Forget it, I don't even get it. Now, here's what I can do as a pastor, as a private citizen. Pastors may endorse candidates in their capacity as private citizens and may allow their title to be used in the endorsement. Which means I have the freedom this afternoon, and I'm home. I am now a private citizen. And I want to give you a phone call to it, okay? You're a private citizen, aren't you? Well, me too. Let me tell you. Isn't it easy how this circumscribes it goes all around and finds the angles that it needs to? Pastors may participate in political committees that are independent of the church. Now look, I know everybody has their own idea about who should be voted for, And I may even have my personal opinion. But I can pretty much bet that if yours is not the same as mine, and you find me at your opposing political party gathering, you're not going to be happy. So, I'm caught between a rock and a hard place on this one, all right? Here we go. Then he said to the crowd again and said to them, "Listen to me, all of you, and understand, there's nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come from out are what defile, for it is from the human heart that evil intentions come, fornication, third, the whole things. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person." And I'm guaranteed, you see, in the political heat of debate, these are the very things that provoke those type of things that can come forth. And all of a sudden, we are the type of people that become not neutral, but totally inflexible. And as a result, what we should be celebrating in the freedom of a republic, of a democratic republic, becomes an arena to shoot each other down. I admit to looking at the funeral of John McCain yesterday and watching and listening to both Democrats and Republicans say, he was a good guy. He was wrong a lot of times, he was right a lot of times, and to see the former vice president come up and say, "I'm a Democrat and I want to talk about John McCain." It is not easy to live the gospel in the midst of all of this. It has been said that our democracy, or Winston Churchill said, it's a horrible form of a political system, but it's the best one we've seen so far. So sometimes we have to live in the crossfire of difficult situations, of different voices that come back and forth. We pick, we choose, we have an idea of where we want the government to go and how we want to do it. But in the meantime, we find that the church itself is not immune to what goes on and what surrounds us. I say that because the church is in constant flux, even though it seems to be going extremely slow. I think that for any of you who are, let's say, over 50 years old and brought up in the Lutheran church, I doubt very much if you would have ever thought you would see the ordination of women. I don't think anybody thought that would happen. But I look upon that as somehow letting the Spirit come in and say, this is a tradition, but you really ought to look at it very carefully and ask yourself, does it make sense given who you are in freedom of Christ, and where Paul says there is no male, female, there is no Jew, there is no Gentile. I look upon what was written and said that mankind are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, the pursuit of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And I know that when that was written, that was very exclusive. It did not include slaves. It did not include women. It did not include even men who didn't own land. And little by little, a tradition was broken, century by century, until all of these things were reinterpreted. And I think what Jesus calls us to do is to look at how we think. Ask ourselves what traditions we hold on to that simply don't make sense anymore. It may have made sense back then. You only have to look at France, at England in the 16th century, and the divine right of kings. When kings said, not only am I king by virtue of politics, I am king by virtue of what God says I should be. And that, of course, was the impetus to bring on the Revolutionary War and said, well, you know what, taxation without representation. People thought, okay, if you want us to be royal subjects, then treat us like human beings. If all of this sounds complex, it's only because it is. But I have a feeling that communities like ours are called to talk civilly to one another. And sometimes when we move through our liturgies and we say, oh, let's try this and see what might happen, we don't do it at the spur of the moment, but we say to ourselves, does this make the gospel clearer? Does it help our people to come into face-to-face with who God is and how God calls them to think differently, to let go of those things that we hold dear, which may not be anything but holding us captive? And that, of course, is what Jesus talks about, this certain freedom. When you think about it, it comes down to the tiniest things in our lives, doesn't it? How do we pray? People tell me, I don't use words. I just sit and be quiet and let the world go away and know that I'm in the presence of God. And another person will say, no. You have to pray in the words Jesus gave us, the Lord's Prayer. And that is fine at certain times. At other times, it doesn't work. So for each of us as individuals who have the right to pursue peace and love and happiness, prosperity, it may come in a different word and in a different way. It is old saying that we all march sometimes to a different drummer, but sooner or later, all of that music has to come together and make sense. So this Saturday, we're going to come together. We've raised our money. We're going to bag food. We're going to send it off to people who we don't even know in some country probably we've never lived in. And all of a sudden, that is a contrary statement over to those things that defile us. And we shall come together next Sunday and celebrate God's work, our hands. And every one of you are invited to be part of that giving. And so as we endeavor to become people who want a government that is expressive of the common good for the common man and common woman, we are addressed not so much by the political system first, but rather what we hear here. That somehow we take to heart that we won't be these people that honor God with lips, with hearts that are far away. That we don't teach human precepts as doctrines that somehow stop the gospel dead in its tracks. And this isn't easy. But as I said yesterday at Jack Jackson's funeral, before I went off, I went back there and I looked at all of the names of those charter members of this church. And Jean is the only one left. And as Jean said, I don't know where any of the others are, although Jack Jackson was one. But they came, and then they went away. But while they were here, they set the foundation for this church. And we owe them a great debt of gratitude. And I'm just hoping, after 58 years of being here, 58 years from now, whoever is sitting in these pews will say, it was a wonderful group of people who lived in this church in 2018 to support the word of the Lord so that we, as the generation that was to come, can speak to each other these words. I don't know what to do with this now. But I'm going to have to think very carefully because I love the country that I live in, and I know that probably you do too. And the music that we're singing this morning is all about patriotism, and we'll leave it at the end after the procession will ask you to stand and sing the national anthem. But there is a dichotomy sometimes between politics and faith. But the secret is to try to find out where they can truly speak to each other with a certain honesty, with a certain openness that says we are responsible people for what happens in this nation, but we are responsible people first to God, who speaks to us in the gospel and says, now, go out and live what you have learned. May God give us the grace to do these things no